Bismillah Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum class. I'm your English teacher Zia. I welcome you to English grade 7 video lessons. My dear learners, for grade 7, now we are dealing with our unit number 4. As you know, it's called the empty pot. And now, this is our lecture number 4C. Let's read our students' learning outcome to see what we are supposed to do. So, our topic is on plot development. This is extracted from our students' learning outcome, and this is from our competency of reading and critical thinking. It says, identify and analyze stages of plot development in a fiction text. And they are exposition, setting, climax, resolution. Now, we need to identify and analyze stages of plot development. A plot has different stages and different elements. So we are going to talk about the stages in a fiction text. A fiction is something that is made up. It is imaginary. So we will be dealing with all these things in our students' learning outcome. Now, let's move on with our vertical linkage that links this SLO with the previous grade that you have already studied. Now, moving on with our brainstorming session for today. So for today's brainstorming, we have a question. You have to think about a story you recently read or watched. Can you remember the main problem the character faced? So think about it. What was the main issue, the conflict, or the problem that was the main part of the story? Now, moving on with our topic, which is about stages of plot development. Now let's see what these stages are and let's explain them one by one along with some examples. But first let's talk about what is plot. So in fiction there is a thing called plot, and the plot is the sequence of events in the story from the beginning to the end, and it has a timeline. So a story, as we know, in a story there are different events, but how the events are sequenced, that is what we call a plot. It has a beginning and it has an ending and also a middle part. So usually the order of events is exposition, the beginning, rising action, climax, falling action, and finally resolution. So we will be seeing all these different stages in our topic, which is about stages of plot development. First, as we talked about, exposition, it is also called beginning. Here your story starts, and then it goes on with when the action rises and when the thing starts happening, we call it rising action. All the problems and the characters are introduced, and now we are moving on to the climax part, to the middle, and then the story starts to have a falling action followed by a resolution, and how the story is resolved, which we also called the end or resolution. So this is our whole graphical representation of stages of plot development. Now let's see them one by one. The exposition or the beginning, the start of the story, the plot is, the beginning of the story is when or where the author introduces the setting, characters, and other important information the readers need to know. So all these things are developed at the very start of our story, which we call exposition. Now, my dear learners, let's look at some examples of exposition. So here you can see a passage. This is taken from the novel The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, and if you have read this or watched the film, it goes like this. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. So, as you can see over here, this is the very start of our novel, The Hobbit. And in the start, the author has introduced the character, which is a kind of a hobbit, and it has a name, and also the setting where the story is taking place, where the character is living. So the setting and the characters is already introduced in the beginning, which we call exposition. So this was an example from The Hobbit, and then let's talk about after exposition and the start, we move to rising action. So in rising action, it's a series of events that builds from the beginning of the story. Rising action is where the author builds interest and tension in the story. So after the exposition, as the story progresses, you are introduced to the characters, and now you are interested in what is going to happen now as things or the story is starting to unfold. This is what we call a rising action, because our action, that's the main part of our plot, is rising to its middle. Now, here is an example of rising action taken from another novel of Tolkien, which is called Lord of the Rings. So, when Frodo leaves the comfort of the Shire, this is when the rising action happens. So, as we talked about in the exposition, the part of the beginning of Hobbit, where the character is a hobbit is living in the comfort home. But now when he leaves the home in Lord of the Rings, now is the time when the readers or the viewers are interested in that what would happen now if he has left. So this is our rising action. It keeps our interest engaged and it keeps us intrigued. Now, let's talk about climax. Now, climax can be called the turning point of the plot or the story. This is the highest point of tension or action in the story. The climax often leads the reader to wonder what will happen. How is everything going to turn out? The climax is an important turning point for the characters or the story. So now this is a climax where you are so much intrigued and interested in the story, and you start asking question to yourself that what will happen now, and you start making predictions. And this comes right in the middle, as we talked about in the graph. Now, here is an example of a climax. So at the ball, Cinderella loses track of time and flees at midnight, leaving behind a glass slipper. The prince, captivated by her, declares he will marry the woman whose foot fits the slipper. So now we start asking questions when we are reading the Cinderella story. It is the peak time and the most interesting part of the story, and it is also a climax. Now, let's talk about the falling action. The events of the story after the climax or turning point, all the actions or the events after the climax are the falling action. The events lead to the end of the story and its resolution. And if you have read the story, Little Red Riding Hood, a woodsman hears Red's cries and rescues her from the wolf. So this is where the story takes its events to the resolution, and the action starts to fall down, and the story is coming to the resolution. So falling action is also a very important part of the plot development. Now at the end we have resolution. So the resolution, where things are started to resolve, is the final outcome or untangling of the events of the story. Now all the questions, all the confusions will be untangled, will be solved, because and this is why we call it resolution. For example, in the story, the tortoise, despite his slow pace, crosses the finish line first, winning the race. The hare learns a valuable lesson about underestimating his opponent and the importance of perseverance. So, if you read the story, The Hare and the Tortoise, at the end, the turtle wins, the tortoise wins, and the hare starts to think about it and develops and got a moral lesson out of it. So this is how our story of the hare and the tortoise was resolved at the end. And now, after learning about all different stages of plot and its development, let's talk about finally concluding our lesson for today. By identifying and analyzing these stages of plot development, readers can better understand how the story is structured, the progression of events, and the significance of key moments. And now we are here at the our simulation link that you can play later on to learn more about plot development and different nuances from it. For your classroom activity, you have to connect the events of the story with the stages of plot. The story is an empty pot, which is a folktale. You need to put the right kind of plot development stage and apply it on the text of the lesson to see if you have understood it completely or not. Now, for your worksheet, you need to read the story and then answer the relevant questions. For your homework, you have to think about a short story, movie, or TV episode you recently enjoyed. If not, then you could watch it. Briefly write down the main problem the character faced, one thing they did to try and solve it, and how the story ended. So, in this way, you can apply what we learned today in our video lesson into your real life. And now, finally, we are here at the end of our video lesson with all these resources before you. They are easily available in the description of the video. You can get so much help from these, and thank you for listening. I hope that our SLO is achieved by the end of our lesson. We talked about plot, stages of plot development, and we talked about each element and each stage one by one with some examples. So till the next video lesson, Allah Hafiz.